My name is Lila Moreno, and I never thought that the people who were supposed to protect me the most could hurt me in ways I couldn't explain to anyone. I remember the moment everything changed like it was yesterday, a blur of pain and fear that I couldn't voice, a secret that my father forced me to carry, and a betrayal I never expected. My mother's hands, once gentle when she braided my hair, became the source of my suffering. That day, when my wrist was broken, I felt an unbearable combination of pain and confusion. And worse, the crushing weight of silence imposed by someone who should have been my protector. My father whispered, "Don't tell anyone." His words supposed to shield me, but instead made me feel trapped, like the walls of our house had become invisible bars holding me in a nightmare. I had no idea then that the very person I trusted to help me recover, the X-ray technician at the hospital, would be the one to see the truth and finally act. The one who would break the chain of secrecy my family demanded I uphold. What followed changed my life forever, tested my courage, and revealed truths that were long hidden in plain sight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It all started on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky heavy with gray clouds that seemed to mirror the tension in our home. I was 13 years old, full of energy and curiosity, the kind of girl who spent hours sketching in her notebooks and running around our small backyard in the suburbs of San Antonio. My mother, Sophia, had always been temperamental, but I never imagined she could hurt me in a way that would leave a permanent mark. That afternoon, a disagreement over something trivial, whether I could go to a friend's birthday party, escalated faster than I could process. Her voice rose sharply, and before I could step back, she grabbed my wrist in anger. I remember the snap, the searing pain that shot up my arm, and the disbelief in my own eyes. The shock was immediate. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. My wrist was throbbing, and when I tried to move it, an unbearable agony tore through my arm. I instinctively cried out, but the look on my mother's face silenced me. She scolded me for reacting, calling me dramatic, and told me firmly that nobody must know about what happened. My father, Ricardo, was in the next room. I ran to him, tears streaming down my face, hoping for comfort, for someone to make the pain stop. Instead, he knelt beside me, placed his hands gently on my shoulders, and said almost softly, "Lila, don't tell anyone. It's better if we keep this between us." His words, meant to protect the family image, left me feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I nodded, swallowing sobs. The sharp pain in my wrist matched the hollow ache in my chest. I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken warning that if I disobeyed, the consequences would be worse than the physical pain itself. My mother's anger hadn't dissipated, and my father's instructions made it clear that this was a secret I must carry silently, a burden far too heavy for a 13-year-old to bear. Despite my fear, my body wouldn't ignore the injury. The swelling grew rapidly, and the dull ache turned into a constant stabbing pain. I knew instinctively that this was more than a minor sprain. My mother seemed distracted, but there was a tension in her eyes when she watched me, a flicker of something I couldn't name. Guilt? Anger? Both? I wasn't sure, and I didn't have the words to ask. My father, meanwhile, insisted that I just needed to rest and keep it elevated, a bandage he wrapped loosely around my wrist to hide the bruising that was already spreading across my hand. He gave me a glass of water, patted my back, and left the room, leaving me to wrestle with both the physical pain and the suffocating weight of secrecy. I tried to focus on small things, counting ceiling tiles, humming the tune of a song I liked, but the pain would not relent. My arm throbbed constantly, and I found myself wincing at every movement, imagining what would happen if anyone found out. Eventually, it became clear that I couldn't ignore it. I begged to see a doctor, claiming it was just a fall from tripping over my shoelaces, a story my father reluctantly allowed me to tell. The drive to the hospital was silent, the car filled with tension so thick it seemed to press against my ears. I could feel my wrist throbbing under the sleeve of my jacket, the dull sound of my mother's breathing beside me, a constant reminder of her presence and the danger of her anger. Sitting in the waiting room, I tried to focus on the whitewashed walls and the magazines scattered across the table, but my mind was consumed with worry. What if someone looked too closely and realized the truth? What if telling the wrong story made everything worse? My pulse quickened with every nurse passing by, each of them a potential judge of my life and my choices.
Finally, my name was called, and I was led to a small room where the X-ray machine stood like a silent witness. As I sat on the table, the technician introduced herself gently, explaining the process. She adjusted my arm, and for the first time since the incident, I felt someone's hands on me without threat or fear. But when the images appeared on the screen, her expression shifted immediately from routine professionalism to concern that I couldn't ignore. She looked at me directly, her eyes sharp and serious, as if she could see every unspoken word in my mind. "Lila," she said quietly, "this isn't just a simple injury. Someone needs to know what happened." And in that moment, I realized that the secret I had been forced to keep, the silence that had been suffocating me, was no longer mine to bear alone. I didn't understand everything that would follow, but I knew somehow that this moment, this simple act of someone noticing and acting, was the start of something I couldn't have imagined, a path toward truth, protection, and justice. After the hospital visit, life at home didn't immediately change. If anything, it grew heavier, as though the walls themselves were pressing down on me with a weight of secrets and unspoken truths. I returned home with my wrist in a bulky cast, the bright white plaster a constant reminder of the incident, and of my mother's volatile temper. Despite the visible evidence, the atmosphere in the house remained tense, almost ritualistically normal on the surface, but every glance, every word, carried an undercurrent of fear and avoidance. My mother, Sophia, avoided looking directly at me for days, her movements around the house cautious, almost rehearsed as though she were performing a role that concealed her anger and shame. She spoke to me only when necessary, her voice clipped and cold, and every interaction felt like walking on a tightrope. One misstep, and her temper could flare again. I learned to nod silently, to answer in short, careful sentences, and to retreat to my room whenever tension in the kitchen or living room threatened to escalate. My father, Ricardo, continued his role as enforcer of secrecy, his expressions stoic and his instructions unwavering. "Remember what I said," he reminded me one evening as we sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp, the soft hum of the air conditioner filling the silence between us. His hands rested lightly on mine, as if to reassure me, but the weight of his words made me feel trapped, imprisoned in a cage built not of bars, but of fear and obedience. I wanted to ask why, to understand, but the words died on my tongue. The house was silent, save for the distant sound of traffic outside, and I realized that the secret I had been forced to keep, the silence that had been suffocating me, was no longer mine to bear alone. I didn't understand everything that would follow, but I knew, somehow, that this moment, this simple act of someone noticing and acting, was the start of something I couldn't have imagined, a path toward truth, protection, and justice. School became another battlefield. I tried to hide my cast under long sleeves and sweaters, careful to avoid questions or curious stares from classmates. At first, my friends were polite, occasionally asking how I had gotten hurt, and I would offer a vague story about tripping on the playground. Each lie felt heavier than the cast on my wrist, and with every repeated retelling, the tension inside me grew. The teachers, too, seemed to accept my explanation without question, nodding and moving on to other students. I learned quickly that adults could be deceived, that appearances mattered more than the truth, and that the secret my father had imposed on me was effective in creating the illusion of normalcy. But inside, I was unraveling. Every twinge of pain from my broken wrist reminded me of that day in the kitchen, the snap that had echoed throughout the house, and the helplessness I had felt as my father demanded silence. Even with the cast, daily life at home was fraught with tension. Household chores, once routine, became mine to navigate carefully. Cooking alongside my mother meant watching her movements, anticipating her moods, avoiding anything that might trigger her anger. Cleaning the living room or helping with laundry was no longer just a responsibility. It was a test, a measure of how carefully I could behave to avoid provoking her. I learned to move like a shadow, quiet, unobtrusive, and compliant. My father's presence was no comfort. While he offered protection in words, his inaction in the face of my mother's temper made me feel as though the house itself had turned against me. Each meal was punctuated by careful silence, each conversation a minefield of potential confrontation, and I became adept at reading subtle cues, tightened lips, narrowed eyes, a pause in speech that signaled danger.
Despite the fear, there were small moments that revealed the contradictions in our household. Glimpses of normalcy that felt almost cruel in contrast to the underlying tension. My mother would sometimes smile at me over a shared meal, her tone gentle as she asked about schoolwork, only to be followed by an unexplained glare or a sharp rebuke if I moved the wrong way. My father similarly could appear comforting, resting his hand on my shoulder in the evenings, yet revert to cold warnings at the slightest indication that I might speak to anyone about what had happened. It was a life balanced on contradictions, care mixed with cruelty, love mixed with fear. And I realized that the real danger wasn't just the pain I had felt from my broken wrist, but the constant uncertainty of how my parents would react in any given moment. I was navigating a world where the people who should have been my protectors were the ones I had to guard myself against. Nighttime was the hardest. In my room, alone with my thoughts, the fear and confusion intensified. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and hums of the house, imagining what could happen if someone found out. I thought of my friends at school, the neighbors, even my teachers, and wondered whether any of them would believe me if I told the truth. The secrecy my father demanded was absolute, and the very thought of breaking it was terrifying. Yet, at the same time, an unrelenting sense of injustice gnawed at me. The pain, both physical and emotional, was a constant reminder that something had to change. I began to imagine the impossible, someone noticing, someone stepping in, someone understanding that the story I was forced to tell wasn't the real story. In my imagination, that someone became a savior, a figure who could see the truth without fear, a person who would validate my pain and protect me from further harm. Little did I know that figure existed, and the moment I would encounter them was closer than I imagined. The seed of hope had been planted at the hospital, in the quiet concern of the X-ray technician, and though I couldn't grasp it yet, the first cracks in the wall of silence were forming. That hospital visit had set in motion a series of events that my parents could not control, a chain reaction that would eventually expose the hidden truth of my life, challenge the authority they had imposed on me, and demand courage I didn't yet know I possessed. In the meantime, I continued to live under the careful, suffocating routine of a household where love and fear were intertwined, where the visible mark of my injury was only the beginning of the invisible scars being etched into my life. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning, months after my initial injury, when the weight of secrecy and fear had grown unbearable. My wrist had healed to some degree, though the cast was gone, leaving behind a faint scar that curved along my forearm, a permanent reminder of what had happened. By then, I had learned to hide the emotional tremors, to suppress the panic that rose whenever my mother's temper flared, and to perform the delicate dance of obedience my father demanded. But that morning, the fragile equilibrium shattered. My mother had awoken in one of her unpredictable moods, a storm that seemed to settle in her chest and radiate outward. She found me in the kitchen, trying to make pancakes for breakfast without disturbing her, and something about the way I was measuring the flour, or maybe the way I was breathing, set her off. Her voice rose sharply, slicing through the quiet like glass breaking, and I froze, my body instinctively recoiling. The argument escalated faster than I could process, her words sharp, her movements aggressive, and before I realized what was happening, she had grabbed my wrist once more. I felt the sharp pain immediately, and panic surged through me, hotter and heavier than anything I had felt before. My wrist snapped in a way that made me scream, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the kitchen and into the rest of the house. I ran toward my father. The fear in my chest made my legs tremble. He was sitting at the dining table, reading the newspaper, his expression calm and composed in a way that only deepened my dread. I reached out, tears streaming down my face, my voice trembling as I tried to convey what had happened. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly, and for a moment, I thought he would finally act, that he would protect me as a parent should. But instead, he sighed heavily and said, "Lila, remember what I told you. Don't tell anyone. It's better if we handle this ourselves." The words were a final barrier, an unyielding wall of authority that left me paralyzed with fear. My mother hovered nearby, her face flushed with anger, her hands still trembling from the aggression she had just unleashed. I wanted to run, to scream, to make someone outside our house know what had happened, but the fear of defying my father, of triggering another wave of anger from my mother, pinned me in place.
My father tried to calm my mother as well, his voice firm yet measured, telling her to sit down and breathe, to not make the situation worse. Yet even as he spoke, the tension in the room was palpable, like electricity ready to ignite at the slightest touch. My mother's eyes darted to me, a mixture of guilt and fury swimming behind the anger. I knew then that I could not rely on either parent to truly protect me. The person I needed, the force that could make a real difference, had to be someone outside this household. Someone neutral, someone who could see the truth without fear. But I didn't know who that person might be, and the thought of exposing my secret left me trembling with uncertainty. The immediate consequence of speaking out seemed terrifyingly immediate. Retribution from my mother, disappointment from my father, and a shattering of the fragile semblance of normalcy that our household maintained. The day passed in a blur of pain, tension, and silence. I couldn't raise my wrist without wincing, and even the softest touch made me flinch. My mother busied herself with chores around the house, her movements sharp and purposeful, avoiding direct eye contact with me, yet I could feel her resentment simmering like a dark current just below the surface. My father remained distant, his advice repeating in my mind, a constant echo. Don't tell anyone. It's better if we handle this ourselves. I understood that in his mind, secrecy was protection, but to me, it felt like imprisonment. I began to wonder if there was anyone in the world who could help me, who would take me seriously, and who would act to ensure I was safe. The fear I carried was compounded by a growing awareness that my parents' version of love was conditional and deeply intertwined with control. By late afternoon, the pain in my wrist had intensified to a throbbing, unbearable level. I realized that hiding it any longer was no longer an option. My mother had returned from running errands, leaving a short window where I could leave the house without her noticing. I bundled my backpack tightly around my wrist, using clothing to obscure the swelling and bruising, and walked to the nearest medical clinic, a place I had been to once before for minor injuries. The journey there was nerve-wracking. Every passing car and pedestrian, a potential witness to my story, or someone who might see through my lies. My hands shook as I approached the front desk, my heart racing with anticipation and fear. I had practiced what I would say, crafting a story of an accidental fall to avoid drawing suspicion, but the weight of the truth pressed on me like a leaden cloak. Inside the clinic, the receptionist asked routine questions, and I answered as best I could, my voice barely above a whisper. When the nurse led me to the examination room, I felt an unexpected wave of relief. Here was someone neutral, someone outside the twisted ecosystem of my home who could assess my injury objectively.
Yet underneath that relief, a lingering terror remained. What if they didn't believe me? What if I had to return home without help, or worse, face my parents' wrath for having sought care? The nurse examined my wrist, palpating gently at first, then with more concern as my reactions indicated something was seriously wrong. She called for an x-ray, and I lay down on the table, my arm positioned carefully, trying not to flinch even though every movement sent sharp pain up my arm. The technician, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a steady demeanor, guided me through the process, explaining each step with patience and calm. I was terrified at first, unsure if I could trust her, yet her presence brought an unexpected sense of safety. When the X-ray images appeared on the screen, the technician's expression shifted immediately, concern etched into every line of her face. She leaned closer, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Lila, you don't have to be afraid here. What happened to you isn't something you should hide." Her calm, authoritative presence felt like a lifeline in the storm I had been struggling to survive alone. The first signs that the world outside my house might intervene came while I was still lying on the examination table, my wrist carefully positioned for the x-ray. The technician, whose name I learned was Marta, studied the images on the monitor with a seriousness that made my stomach twist into knots. Every line of the broken bone, every shadow of swelling and bruising was undeniable. She didn't speak at first, simply tapping on the screen, zooming in and out, and then looking at me with wide, concerned eyes. "This isn't an accident," she said quietly, more to herself than to me, and the weight of her words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to nod to confirm silently that yes, it wasn't an accident, but the instinct to obey my father's instructions kept my lips sealed. But Marta seemed to sense my hesitation, the fear that had kept me silent for months, and she leaned closer, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Lila, you don't have to be afraid here. What happened to you isn't something you should hide." Her calm, authoritative presence felt like a lifeline in a storm I had been struggling to survive alone.
When the images were reviewed by the radiologist, the verdict was immediate and uncompromising. The fracture was severe, the kind that couldn't have been caused by a minor fall or accidental bump. Marta, along with the radiologist, conferred quietly, but I could overhear enough to know that they were discussing reporting the injury. My heart raced. I had been carrying the weight of silence for months, and the possibility that someone else would break it for me filled me with both hope and terror. The fear of retaliation from my mother and the disappointment from my father clashed with the desperate need for protection and validation. I wanted to hide under the table, to escape the impossible choice I had been placed in, but Marta's steady gaze anchored me in the moment. She was already taking steps I couldn't imagine, steps that would expose the truth my father had insisted I keep hidden. By the time the hospital social worker arrived, summoned by Marta, my parents had been called. My mother, Sophia, stormed into the hospital, her face red and contorted with anger and disbelief. My father, Ricardo, followed, his calm veneer still intact, but his eyes betraying concern, not for my safety, but for the embarrassment and exposure of the family secret. The contrast between the two adults was stark, one brimming with volatile fury, the other rigid with controlled authority. They approached me cautiously, their voices low but tense, as they asked what had happened. I sat frozen, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. The presence of Marta and the social worker created a pressure I could not ignore. The x-rays, the expert opinion, and the insistence of professionals left my parents and mother facing the undeniable reality. The fracture was not a lie, and the secrecy they demanded was impossible to maintain. The hospital room became a battleground of subtle power and control. My mother attempted to downplay the injury, claiming I had fallen from a low step in the backyard, that it was an accident that didn't require anyone to get involved. My father reinforced this narrative, trying to reassure the hospital staff that everything was under control, that no further intervention was necessary. But the X-ray and Marta's concern had shifted the dynamic irreversibly. The evidence was objective, undeniable, and the professionals' insistence that reporting the injury was required placed my parents on the defensive. Their attempts to maintain the cover-up began to fail in real time. Every claim they made was scrutinized against the hard proof on the screen,
and the professionals were not swayed by excuses, threats, or pleas. For the first time, I saw my mother's composure crack, a flicker of fear passing over her face. Even my father, who had long been the voice of calm authority in our house, looked momentarily powerless. It was during this confrontation that the reality sunk in. The secret I had been forced to keep was no longer mine to protect. External eyes, the X-ray technician, the radiologist, the social worker, saw the truth in a way my parents could not control. The authority of the hospital, the undeniable evidence of my broken wrist, and the professionalism of those involved created a point of no return. My parents' cover-up, which had governed my life for months, was collapsing. I could sense the shift in power, the subtle but significant change that occurred when objective truth is presented alongside human authority. The panic and control my parents had exerted over me were being challenged, not by me, but by people who had no personal stake in the family narrative. Despite my lingering fear, I felt a flicker of relief, a sense that the nightmare of secrecy might be ending. The professionals were clear. The injury could not be ignored, the circumstances could not be dismissed, and someone had to take steps to ensure my safety. My parents tried to protest, arguing that it was unnecessary to involve anyone else, but their words held no weight against the tangible proof of my wrist and the ethical obligations of the hospital staff. My mother's temper flared again, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but even she could not deny the facts before her. My father's reassurances had no impact. The point of no return had been reached. My secret, once imposed as a burden by their authority, was now in the hands of people who could act to protect me. By the end of that day, I realized that life as I had known it would never be the same. The first plot point had been crossed. The external eyes had seen the truth. The cover-up had begun to crumble, and the control my parents had exerted over me was no longer absolute. For the first time, I felt a mixture of fear and empowerment. The fear of my mother's reaction once the authorities got involved, and the empowerment that came with knowing that the truth had allies outside the house. I had stepped over the threshold, and there was no turning back. The events of that day marked the beginning of a confrontation that would challenge family loyalty, expose long-hidden lies, and ultimately force me to claim my voice in ways I had never imagined. The fragile illusion of safety and control that had governed my life was gone, replaced by the undeniable fact that truth, once seen, could not be hidden again.
The days following the hospital visit were unlike anything I had experienced before. The tension that had always pervaded our household transformed into a pressure cooker, an invisible weight pressing against every interaction, every glance, every step I took. My mother, Sophia, seemed constantly on edge, pacing through the living room as if she were anticipating the walls themselves might collapse under the truth that had begun to leak from our home. Her anger had not dissipated. It had only evolved into a simmering, unpredictable force. She watched my every move with sharp, calculating eyes, measuring reactions, tone, even the way I held my wrist. I had grown accustomed to her volatility over the years, but now there was a new layer, fear of exposure, that made her unpredictable in ways I could not navigate. The house felt like a minefield. Every conversation a potential spark, every unintentional movement a risk of triggering another outburst. I learned to move slowly, to speak cautiously, to exist in a state of heightened awareness that left me exhausted by nightfall. My father, Ricardo, meanwhile, was a more complex presence. He had always been a figure of authority, calm and commanding, but after the hospital incident, his control seemed to falter. On one hand, he attempted to maintain the illusion of normalcy, repeating his insistence that no one outside the house should know what had happened. On the other hand, he became defensive and watchful, scrutinizing every word I said, every glance I exchanged with friends or neighbors. The duality of his role, both protector and enforcer of secrecy, created an internal tension that I could feel radiating through the house.
I began to sense that while he wanted to shield the family from external scrutiny, he also feared the consequences of letting the truth reach anyone who might act on it. This duality left me in a precarious position, torn between the instinct to seek help and the paralyzing fear of what would happen if I disobeyed him. The rising opposition manifested not just in their behaviors, but in subtle, almost imperceptible forms of intimidation. I would find my mother lurking near doorways, her gaze sharp and accusatory, as if she could see the secret trying to escape through my eyes. Conversations became interrogations disguised as casual questions. "Did anyone ask about your wrist today?" she would ask. Each syllable weighted with implied threat. My father would interject occasionally, reminding me of the consequences of speaking to anyone outside the family, of betraying the pact of silence. The accumulation of these moments created a suffocating atmosphere in which fear and obedience replaced trust and safety. I began to realize that the opposition was not just external, but embedded in the very fabric of my home, a constant pressure designed to suppress the truth. Yet the evidence continued to mount against them. The hospital had documented my injury with precision, noting the severity of the fracture and the improbability that it was accidental. The social worker's report, though confidential, added a layer of external verification that neither of my parents could manipulate. Each letter, each note, each record that existed outside our household became a quiet weapon in the struggle between truth and control. I became aware of the significance of these documents, understanding that they held the potential to challenge my parents' narrative and to validate my experience in a way that my words alone could not. The growing body of evidence created a tension that was palpable within the walls of our home, an invisible pressure that reminded my parents that the cover-up was no longer sustainable. School became another arena for tension. I had initially tried to maintain the story of a minor fall, but as the physical evidence became more apparent, persistent swelling, lingering tenderness, and the faint scar that traced the curve of my wrist, it was harder to conceal the truth. Teachers noticed, asked questions, and each time I attempted a deflection, the story felt thinner, less convincing. I could see the subtle recognition in their eyes, a sense that something beyond a simple accident had occurred. The internal conflict grew sharper with each passing day. I wanted to speak, to explain, to unburden myself of the secret that had been forced upon me. But the fear of my mother's retribution and my father's disappointment was a constant deterrent, a mental barrier that kept me trapped in silence, even as the evidence accumulated around me. The rising opposition was not just about physical evidence, but also about emotional truth. Friends, unaware of the full scope of my experience, occasionally expressed concern, offering sympathy or asking for details. Each encounter was a test of my ability to maintain composure and uphold the lie I had been instructed to tell. Every question felt like a potential exposure, every kind gesture a reminder of my isolation. I became acutely aware of the burden I was carrying, of the way fear had permeated every aspect of my life. Even the simplest interactions, lunch with classmates, walking home from school, talking to a neighbor, were complicated by the duality of my existence, the reality of my injury and trauma, and the narrative I was forced to present to the outside world.
Despite the fear, there was a growing sense of inevitability. The professionals who had seen my injury were not going away, and the documentation they produced meant that the truth was gaining traction beyond the walls of my home. I began to sense that the rising opposition was a temporary barrier, a delaying tactic in the face of overwhelming evidence. While my parents attempted to exert control through fear, the accumulation of objective facts and witness accounts steadily chipped away at their authority. The tension reached a point where I could feel it vibrating in the air, a tangible force that made it impossible to ignore that a confrontation was coming. I was no longer alone in the struggle. The external witnesses had entered the story, and their involvement signaled the beginning of a turning point, where truth would demand recognition, where courage would be tested, and where the balance of power in my household would be challenged. The midpoint arrived with a clarity that cut through months of fear and uncertainty.
an undeniable revelation that left no room for doubt or denial. It was a Thursday morning when the child protection investigator arrived at our home, summoned by the hospital reports and the X-ray technician's insistence that the authorities needed to be notified. I remember the moment vividly. The sharp knock on the front door, the polite but firm voice asking to speak with my parents and me, and the heavy, almost tangible shift in the air. My mother's expression tightened, a mask of controlled anger settling across her face, while my father's usual calm betrayed a flicker of concern that they both tried desperately to suppress. For months, they had relied on secrecy and intimidation to maintain control. But the arrival of an objective, impartial authority immediately disrupted the delicate balance of power in our household. The investigator carried documents, forms, and a professional presence that radiated both competence and insistence. I could feel the weight of everything I had endured pressing down in that moment, and beneath the fear, a flicker of relief stirred. The conversation began formally, with introductions and the professional outlining the reason for the visit. I sat on the edge of the living room couch, my wrist wrapped tightly in its cast, trying to make myself small while simultaneously feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being supported by someone outside my parents' influence. My mother immediately launched into a carefully constructed narrative of an accidental fall in the backyard, her voice steady and precise, attempting to frame the situation as a minor mishap blown out of proportion by the hospital staff. My father, seated beside her, nodded in agreement, reiterating that the injury was unfortunate but accidental, that it did not warrant intervention from authorities, and that I was otherwise a healthy, happy child. Their confidence was deliberate, an attempt to control the narrative before it could be challenged. But the investigator's calm, authoritative presence left little room for deception. She asked specific questions, requested to see the X-rays, and inquired about medical records. Each request, each careful inquiry chipped away at the stories my parents were telling, exposing inconsistencies that neither of them could reconcile. The undeniable proof emerged when the investigator reviewed the hospital documents and the X-ray images themselves. The fracture, severe and unmistakable, did not align with the story my parents were presenting. The angle of the break, the healing patterns noted by the radiologist, and the persistent swelling and bruising all pointed to a forceful, intentional action rather than an accidental fall. The investigator's eyes narrowed slightly as she compared the records, and I could feel the gravity of the moment settling over us. For the first time, I witnessed a shift in my mother's composure. Her careful mask of control faltered, revealing a flicker of panic, an almost imperceptible tremor in her hands. My father, too, appeared unsettled, the rigid authority he had wielded for so long, faltering in the face of objective evidence. The undeniable proof of the injury and the circumstances surrounding it rendered all previous claims moot. The careful constructions of secrecy and control that had governed my life were crumbling, and there was no longer a path to maintain the facade. As the investigator spoke to me privately, her tone was gentle but firm, creating a space where I could finally express the truth without fear of immediate reprisal. I recounted the incident, my words trembling but steadily gaining momentum as the fear began to be replaced by a sense of empowerment. I described my mother's temper, the moment of the break, my father's instructions to remain silent, and the months of fear and control that had followed. Each word felt like a release, a small but significant step toward reclaiming my voice. The investigator listened carefully, occasionally nodding or taking notes, and I realized that for the first time, someone outside the household was validating my experience. The evidence I had carried silently for months was now recognized and supported by professional authority. The magnitude of this acknowledgement was profound. It was not just the recognition of physical injury, but the validation of my experience, my fear, and my need for protection. The confrontation between the undeniable evidence and my parents' attempts of deception was stark. The investigators' questions exposed gaps and contradictions in their story, forcing my mother to stumble over details she could not reconcile. My father attempted to maintain composure, but his reliance on authority and intimidation proved ineffective against professional scrutiny. Every attempt to control or manipulate the narrative faltered. Every carefully constructed excuse dissolved under the weight of objective facts. It was in this moment, the midpoint of my ordeal, that the turning point crystallized. The truth could no longer be hidden, the consequences could no longer be avoided, and the path forward required action. My parents were confronted with a reality they could neither deny nor control, and the scales of power irrevocably shifted.
By the end of the day, the undeniable proof had set in motion an irreversible change. The investigator left with a plan to ensure my safety, including temporary protective measures and follow-up with child services. My parents were left to face the immediate consequences of exposure, their authority diminished, and their attempts at secrecy invalidated by objective evidence. For me, the sensation was surreal. Fear and relief intertwined, anxiety and hope existing side by side. The invisible chains that had bound me for months were beginning to break, replaced by a growing sense of empowerment and clarity. I realized that the undeniable proof was not merely a confirmation of my suffering, it was a beacon, a turning point signaling that the truth, once documented and verified, could no longer be suppressed. My journey toward justice, safety, and reclamation of my voice had begun, and the path forward, though uncertain, was illuminated by the certainty that my story could finally be seen, believed, and acted upon. The days following the investigator's visit were some of the most difficult I had ever experienced, a period where fear and anticipation collided in a way that made every moment feel both suffocating and electric. My parents had retreated into themselves, their composure fractured, replaced by subtle but constant attempts to intimidate and manipulate me into silence. My mother, Sophia, was restless, pacing the house with her hands clenched and her eyes darting to see if I was observing her, as if I were a threat she could not contain. She would comment casually on minor misbehaviors, on chores done incorrectly, or even the tone of my voice, each remark dripping with the implicit warning that she still wielded power over me. My father, Ricardo, alternated between feigned calm and sharp reprimands, his attempts to reassert control failing against the mounting tide of external scrutiny. They were acutely aware that the hospital records, the investigator's involvement, and the undeniable physical evidence of my wrist had weakened the authority they had long imposed over me. The tension was palpable. It saturated the air in our home and left me walking through each day in a fragile state of alertness, unsure of when the next confrontation might erupt. I felt, more than ever, the weight of responsibility pressing on me, not just to protect myself, but to decide whether to embrace the courage I had been nurturing quietly for months. The investigator's presence had offered me a glimpse of possibility. Someone outside my parents' influence could validate my experience, take action, and potentially safeguard me from further harm. But acting on that opportunity required a decision that terrified me. I could stay silent, preserve what remained of my parents' control, and continue living under the shadow of fear, or I could step forward fully, embrace the truth, and risk the immediate consequences of defying them. That choice was crushing. It was a fork in the path of my life that demanded bravery I was unsure I possessed. Every day, the question haunted me. If I spoke out, would my voice be strong enough to withstand the backlash, to confront the secrecy, and to demand justice without collapsing under the pressure? The catalyst for my decision came unexpectedly during a late afternoon when my mother lost control over a minor incident in the kitchen. A spilled cup of juice, something trivial and inconsequential, ignited a rage I could no longer tolerate. She screamed, her words sharp and unrelenting, and in a sudden violent motion, she grabbed my arm, the same arm that had been broken months earlier. Pain shot through me, but this time it was accompanied by a surge of determination. I had endured fear, secrecy, and threats for too long. I realized that remaining silent was no longer an option, that to protect myself and reclaim my life, I had to confront the truth directly. It was the moment when the abstract possibility of courage transformed into the concrete necessity of action. I could no longer be passive. I had to speak. I sought out my father first, unsure if he would help or hinder me. I explained, as calmly as I could manage, that I would no longer remain silent, that the events surrounding my injury and the ongoing threats to my safety could not be hidden any longer. My father's reaction was complex. He oscillated between anger, disbelief, and a faint glimmer of understanding. For the first time, I saw the possibility of him choosing to align with me rather than with my mother's attempts at control. He hesitated, the internal conflict evident on his face, and for a moment I feared his inaction might leave me vulnerable. But ultimately, he nodded slightly, acknowledging the reality that the truth could not be contained and that my decision to speak out was both necessary and inevitable. His reluctant support was enough to bolster my courage, giving me the strength to confront my mother and take the next step toward exposing the hidden truths that had dominated my life. The confrontation with my mother was intense and immediate. I faced her directly, my voice shaking at first, but growing stronger as I continued. I recounted the events of the injury, the months of fear and suppression, and the ways in which her anger and my father's insistence on secrecy had harmed me emotionally and physically. Every word felt like a release, a reclamation of power that had long been withheld. My mother's initial response was denial, her face hardening, her tone rising, but the presence of my father, along with the knowledge that external authorities had already verified my injury, made her usual tactics ineffective. The dynamic had shifted. The private control she had wielded so ruthlessly was now tempered by the reality that others had seen and documented the truth. For the first time, I witnessed her anger tempered by a flicker of fear, the understanding that her attempts to maintain secrecy were no longer viable.
By the end of that confrontation, I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. The decision to speak had not been easy. It had required summoning courage that I had doubted I possessed. Yet, the act of articulating the truth, facing my mother's resistance, and acknowledging the months of fear I had endured created a profound shift within me. I was no longer solely a passive participant in my own life, trapped by secrecy and fear. I had taken control of my narrative, embraced my voice, and begun to assert my right to safety, protection, and validation. The choice to speak was a pivotal turning point, a decisive action that would shape the next phase of my journey, as my parents, allies, and authorities all began to respond to the truth I had finally embraced. The all-or-nothing decision to no longer protect the secret marked the culmination of the protagonist's internal struggle, setting the stage for the mounting confrontations and resolutions to come. The mounting pressure hit our household like a physical force, a constant vibration of tension that infiltrated every corner, every conversation, every glance exchanged between family members. After I had taken the decisive step of speaking out, the dynamics shifted, but not in the way I had initially hoped. My mother, Sophia, was no longer able to hide her fury behind controlled composure. The mask had slipped entirely, revealing a relentless, vindictive energy that seemed to feed on my vulnerability. She prowled the house with a constant, watchful intensity, questioning my movements, my words, even the most innocuous interactions with neighbors or friends. Her anger was no longer subtle or veiled. It had become a direct and relentless assault, a barrage designed to intimidate and regain control. Every minor misstep I made, dropping a book, forgetting a chore, or raising my voice in conversation, was met with disproportionate rage, each reaction a calculated attempt to assert dominance and suppress the truth I had begun to claim. My father, Ricardo, was caught in a more complex web. He had been the enforcer of secrecy, the calm voice advocating silence, but now, confronted with the undeniable proof and my unwavering decision to speak, he was forced into a new role. mediator, reluctant protector, and a witness to my mother's escalating aggression. His authority, once unchallenged within the household, had become compromised. He attempted to temper my mother's outbursts, speaking in controlled, measured tones, trying to maintain some semblance of order. Yet even his efforts were met with resistance, subtle defiance, and bursts of anger that highlighted the impossibility of controlling the situation entirely. The household had become a pressure cooker, each family member reacting to the reality that the hidden truth could no longer be contained. Every glance I exchanged with my parents was charged with tension, a silent acknowledgement that the rules of our home had been rewritten and the consequences of the exposure were rapidly unfolding. The confrontation with the antagonist, the embodiment of secrecy and control, intensified as external forces began to engage directly. The child protection investigator had returned to follow up on my case, armed with the hospital records, x-rays, and my testimony. Her presence in the house was a constant reminder to my mother that the power she had wielded for years was no longer absolute. For the first time, the external validation of my experience acted as a tangible weapon against her attempts to intimidate me. She reacted with a mixture of fear, frustration, and fury, her anger now directed toward the authorities who had breached her control. She shouted at me to retract my statements, tried to explain away the injury as accidental, and even attempted to manipulate my father into aligning with her narrative. Yet the mounting pressure of objective truth, the x-rays, the social worker reports, and the professional insistence that my safety was paramount rendered these tactics ineffective. School also became a battleground for the mounting tension. Teachers who had previously expressed concern about my wrist began asking more pointed questions, requesting to see medical documentation and discussing potential interventions with guidance counselors. My mother attempted to minimize these interactions, insisting that the injury was minor and accidental. But the growing body of evidence outside our home left her increasingly isolated and ineffective. Friends who had previously noticed the bruising or swelling were now indirectly involved, asking innocent questions that I could answer truthfully without disclosing the full details, yet each inquiry added to my mother's anxiety and sense of losing control. The environment outside the house had begun to reinforce the undeniable proof I had presented within it, and the mounting pressure on my mother intensified with each acknowledgement of the truth from external parties. The psychological impact of this mounting pressure was profound. I oscillated between fear and relief, anxiety and empowerment, aware that my mother's escalating aggression could erupt at any moment, yet buoyed by the knowledge that I was no longer navigating this alone. The presence of objective evidence and professional oversight created a buffer, a form of protection that I had never previously experienced. My father's reluctant support added another layer of safety, though the household remained a site of constant tension. Each day required vigilance, strategic thinking, and careful navigation of my mother's volatile moods. The stakes were higher than ever, and the confrontation with the antagonist, the embodiment of secrecy and control, had reached a point where the pressure was undeniable, inescapable, and emotionally exhausting.
Despite the intensity of the situation, there were moments of clarity and empowerment. I began to understand the significance of the mounting pressure. It was the necessary force that forced the hidden truth into the light, the catalyst for action, and the mechanism by which accountability would eventually be demanded. My mother's aggression, while frightening and oppressive, inadvertently highlighted the validity of my experience. Her attempts to suppress the truth revealed the lengths to which she had gone to maintain control, making the undeniable proof of my wrist fracture and her culpability even more significant. I realized that the confrontation with deception, the escalation of threats, and the external validation of my narrative were all intertwined, creating a turning point where truth and courage intersected. By the end of this period, I could feel a subtle but powerful shift. The mounting pressure had transformed fear into a tool for survival and empowerment. The external authorities were engaged,
The evidence was undeniable, and the antagonist's attempts at intimidation were increasingly ineffective. My own voice, once suppressed and silenced, had begun to assert itself with clarity and confidence. The confrontation was far from over, and the tension remained high, but the trajectory of events was irreversible. The forces aligned in favor of truth had created a moment where courage, action, and exposure intersected, setting the stage for the inevitable consequences, justice, and vindication that were yet to come. The mounting pressure was no longer merely a threat, it had become a catalyst for transformation. After weeks of mounting pressure and relentless confrontation, the aftermath of my decision to speak the truth settled over me like a dense, suffocating fog. The emotional and physical toll of the previous months became impossible to ignore as the consequences of exposing the hidden abuse began to unfold in ways I had feared most. My mother, Sophia, had retreated into a cold, calculated hostility that made the house feel like a prison rather than a home. Her anger, which had once been explosive and unpredictable, now manifested in quieter but equally powerful forms of intimidation. Slamming doors when she passed, throwing objects near me without warning, or whispering threats in tones sharp enough to send chills down my spine. Every interaction, no matter how routine, became an exercise in self-preservation. I had assumed that speaking the truth would bring relief, a sense of liberation, but instead it opened a new chapter of uncertainty, one in which safety was still precarious and the emotional strain relentless. The isolation I felt was equally profound. Friends and teachers offered support, but the intensity of the situation prevented me from fully engaging with the outside world. I found myself withdrawing from casual interactions, fearful that any slip of the tongue could exacerbate my mother's wrath or create complications with the ongoing investigation. Even my father, Ricardo, though sympathetic and supportive, could only do so much. His presence offered some protection, but it could not shield me entirely from the psychological weight of living under constant threat. The house, once a place of relative predictability, had transformed into a landscape of tension, every shadow and sound a potential warning sign. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, my movements calculated to avoid provoking her, my words chosen with painstaking care. The emotional exhaustion was compounded by the physical reality of my healing wrist, a constant reminder of the abuse I had endured and the vulnerability that persisted despite my growing courage. Compounding this isolation were the threats I began to receive indirectly from my mother's network, friends, family members, and neighbors who had been complicit in maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Subtle warnings arrived in the form of phone calls, casual comments, and veiled advice meant to remind me that speaking out came with consequences. It was as if the entire world I had known was being mobilized to reinforce the fear and guilt my mother had instilled over the years. Each message, each indirect confrontation added to the emotional weight I carried, making it difficult to maintain the sense of empowerment I had briefly experienced when I first chose to tell the truth. My body, mind, and spirit all reacted to the relentless pressure, and I began to question whether speaking out had truly been the right choice, even as I knew deep down that silence was no longer an option. The investigation itself brought another layer of intensity. Social workers, law enforcement officials, and medical professionals were involved in assessing the situation, interviewing family members, and documenting my account of events. While their involvement was ultimately protective, it was also invasive and exhausting. I had to relive the moments of fear and injury repeatedly, recounting the experience to individuals who, while impartial and professional, required a level of detail that left me emotionally drained. Each retelling was a reminder of the trauma I had endured and the reality that my mother's abuse could no longer be hidden. Despite their support, the process reminded me that the consequences of exposure were immediate and unavoidable. My mother's aggression escalated further as she realized the investigation was impartial, thorough, and unlikely to be influenced by her attempts at intimidation. The backlash was intense, leaving me to navigate a daily landscape of fear, uncertainty, and emotional strain.
Sleep offered little relief. Nights were filled with anxiety, the echoes of my mother's threats, and vivid memories of the day my wrist was broken. I would wake repeatedly, heart racing, sweat dampening my pajamas, fearing that the day would bring yet another confrontation. The physical pain of my healing wrist reminded me of the severity of what I had endured, while the emotional pain, the isolation, fear, and ongoing threats was even more exhausting. I questioned whether I had done the right thing by speaking out, whether the temporary empowerment was worth the daily terror, and whether my family would ever be able to reconcile with the truth that had now become inescapable. The weight of these doubts pressed down relentlessly, making it difficult to maintain hope or clarity in the midst of such a chaotic and emotionally charged environment. Yet, in the midst of this dark night of the soul, a subtle shift began to occur. Despite the emotional and physical backlash, I could sense the undeniable impact of my courage. The investigation continued, professionals validated my account, and external authorities remained involved, ensuring that my safety was no longer solely dependent on the fragile cooperation of my parents. Though the immediate consequences of speaking out were severe, threats, intimidation, isolation, the foundation for eventual justice and vindication was being laid. It was in this low point, when fear and uncertainty were at their peak, that I began to understand that resilience is forged in the crucible of adversity. The worst of the emotional toll underscored the necessity of my actions, revealing the contrast between temporary suffering and long-term safety, between isolation and empowerment. By the end of this period, I realized that the lowest point was not the end of my story, but a pivotal stage in the journey. It was the moment when the emotional stakes were highest, when courage was tested most severely, and when the eventual triumph of truth would be all the more profound. The consequences were real, immediate, and deeply challenging, but they also confirmed that my voice had power, that my experience mattered, and that the foundation for justice had been firmly established. The dark night of the soul, though grueling and painful, became a necessary passage, a proving ground for the resilience, clarity, and strength that would carry me through the remaining stages of my journey towards safety, vindication, and transformation. The final push arrived with a sense of both dread and anticipation, a culmination of months of fear, secrecy, and mounting pressure that now demanded resolution. The culmination of the investigation had led to a formal meeting at the local Child Protective Services office, where my parents, the investigators, and I were all present. I remember walking into that room, my casted wrist still tender, my heart hammering in my chest, and feeling the weight of every decision I had made up to this point pressing down on me. Every glance from my mother felt like a spark that could ignite another eruption of anger. Every word from my father was measured, almost pleading for control over a situation that was rapidly escaping their grasp. For months, the truth had simmered beneath the surface, and now it was being placed under the scrutiny of impartial authority, where facts and evidence would determine the outcome, rather than intimidation or fear. The meeting began formally, with the investigator laying out the case, my injury, the documented x-rays, the hospital reports, and my testimony, all corroborated by the x-ray technician's earlier insistence to involve the authorities. Each piece of evidence was presented with precision and clarity, leaving little room for denial or deflection. My mother attempted her usual tactic of minimizing the severity, claiming the break had been accidental and exaggerating the attention it had received. But the professionals present were unyielding. The documentation spoke for itself. The angle of the fracture, the healing pattern, and the consistency of my account all pointed clearly to abuse. Each reference to the evidence tightened the noose around my mother's attempts to control the narrative. And with every assertion of fact, I felt a mixture of relief and vindication. For the first time, the weight of truth was fully aligned with external authority, amplifying its power beyond the confines of my home. My father's role during the meeting was complex. He attempted to mediate, balancing the instinct to defend his spouse with the undeniable evidence before us. Yet it became apparent that even he could no longer sustain the illusion of accidental injury. His comments, though cautious, reflected a subtle acknowledgement that the abuse had occurred and that my choice to speak out was both justified and necessary. The room seemed to contract around these dynamics, the tension thick and almost physical as the confrontation reached its apex. I realized that this was the moment where all the preparation, fear, and courage would be tested. Not just mine, but the power of truth against years of denial, manipulation, and secrecy.
As the investigator questioned my mother directly, the facade she had maintained for years began to crumble. Her responses became increasingly defensive, her voice rising with frustration, and her hands shaking slightly as the weight of the undeniable evidence pressed against her carefully constructed story. The professionals methodically dissected her claims, comparing them with documented facts, and each contradiction weakened her authority and influence. It was as if the room itself was a crucible, stripping away the layers of deception and leaving only the raw truth visible. I felt a strange combination of fear and empowerment, observing the once dominant figure of my mother reduced by the force of facts and accountability. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. No amount of anger, pleading, or manipulation could override the objective proof that had now become the center of attention.
When my turn came to speak, I felt a surge of clarity. I recounted the events leading to my injury, the months of fear and isolation, and the ongoing threats and manipulation I had endured. My voice trembled at first, but the presence of impartial authority lent weight and legitimacy to my words. I could see the impact in the eyes of the investigators, their nods acknowledging the courage and accuracy of my account. My mother attempted to interrupt, to redirect the narrative, but the professionals maintained control, ensuring that my voice was fully heard without interference. For the first time, I felt the full power of my testimony, validated not just by my words, but by the corroborating evidence and the authority of those committed to my protection. It was an overwhelming mix of emotion, relief, empowerment, and a cautious hope that justice could finally be realized. The climax of the confrontation reached its peak when the investigators summarized their findings and outlined the next steps. My mother's attempts at minimizing the situation were entirely ineffective. The objective evidence and my consistent testimony had created a scenario where denial was no longer tenable. Protective measures were formally recommended, including temporary separation and mandatory monitoring to ensure my safety. My father's reluctant acknowledgement of the truth further diminished her influence, reinforcing the alignment of authority, evidence, and courage. The finality of these actions created a sense of resolution within the room, a tangible shift in the balance of power that affirmed the truth I had fought to reveal. Walking out of that meeting, I felt a complex mixture of exhaustion and triumph. The final confrontation had tested my courage in ways I had not anticipated, but the process had also validated the months of fear, preparation, and resilience. The truth had been formally presented, examined, and acted upon, and the consequences for those responsible were beginning to take shape. It was a turning point where the hidden abuse could no longer exist in the shadows, where accountability and justice had become real and immediate. I felt the weight of my journey, the cost of fear and silence, and the profound impact of speaking out. And I realized that the final push, the climax of confrontation, was not just a procedural victory, but a transformative moment that affirmed the power of truth and the courage required to confront it.
In the days following the formal confrontation, a profound sense of validation and relief began to take hold, gradually replacing the relentless tension that had dominated my life for months. The steps taken by the Child Protective Services, the hospital, and the legal authorities had shifted the environment around me in ways that felt almost surreal. My mother, Sophia, though still present in the house, had lost the unchecked authority she once wielded so ruthlessly. Her attempts at intimidation and control were now met with professional oversight and clear boundaries, and the fear that had long dictated my behavior slowly started to loosen its grip. Each interaction, once fraught with uncertainty and potential danger, became an opportunity to reclaim a sense of safety and agency. The tangible presence of justice, the recognition of the truth, and the support of external authorities created a new equilibrium where my voice was acknowledged, my experiences validated, and my well-being prioritized. My father, Ricardo, assumed a more consistent role as a reluctant protector, navigating the delicate balance between his complicated feelings toward my mother and the undeniable reality of what had occurred. For the first time, he engaged actively with the recommendations of the authorities, ensuring that the necessary precautions were implemented to secure my safety. His presence, while previously inconsistent, became a stabilizing force in the household. I began to feel that I was no longer alone in advocating for my own protection, and the collaborative acknowledgement of the truth reinforced my own sense of legitimacy. Together, the alignment of professional authority, parental support, and my own assertion of truth laid the foundation for a new form of equilibrium, where fear no longer dictated the rules of the household.
The immediate aftermath of the official actions brought tangible consequences for my mother, reinforcing the power of accountability. Her movements were monitored more closely, her attempts to manipulate and intimidate curtailed by the presence of oversight and mandated compliance with professional guidelines. The shift in power was palpable. She could no longer rely on secrecy, threats, or intimidation to maintain control. For the first time, the home felt structured around safety and fairness rather than fear and coercion. The evidence that had been presented, the x-rays, hospital records, and consistent testimony served as both a shield for me and a mechanism to enforce boundaries. This tangible framework allowed me to begin redefining my relationship with my parents, particularly the dynamic that had long centered around secrecy and control. Emotionally, the validation I experienced was transformative. For months, I had questioned my perception, doubted my own voice, and feared the consequences of speaking out. Now, with objective authorities confirming the truth of my experience and taking action to ensure my safety, I could finally internalize the reality that I had been neither exaggerating nor imagining the abuse I endured. The relief was accompanied by a profound sense of empowerment, the realization that courage and honesty, even in the face of fear and intimidation, had tangible effects. I began to see my own strength and resilience, the capacity to confront hidden truths, and the importance of advocating for oneself even when the stakes are high. The experience instilled a newfound confidence that extended beyond the immediate circumstances, shaping my approach to challenges and relationships moving forward. At school, the environment shifted as well. Teachers, counselors, and administrators who had previously expressed concern now engaged with me in a supportive and protective capacity, aware of the steps being taken to ensure my safety. Friends who had sensed the tension at home now interacted with me without the previous layers of worry and secrecy, allowing me to gradually reclaim a sense of normalcy in social settings. The alignment of authority figures across multiple domains, home, school, and medical institutions, reinforced the legitimacy of my experience and allowed me to rebuild trust in external systems. This collective acknowledgement created a space where I could begin to process the trauma I had endured while simultaneously developing the tools to navigate a future defined less by fear and more by empowerment. Even within the home, small but significant changes became evident. Daily routines were now structured around accountability, with clear boundaries for behavior and interactions. My mother's influence, while still present, was diminished in the face of external oversight and internal recognition of her past actions. My father's support, coupled with the monitoring of professionals, created a household environment where safety, honesty, and responsibility began to take precedence over secrecy and fear. The practical implementation of these boundaries reinforced the emotional and psychological recovery I was experiencing, allowing me to move from a state of reactive survival to one of proactive self-advocacy. By the end of this period, the equilibrium was not merely a cessation of immediate danger, but a transformation in the way I perceived my own agency and potential. The validation of my experiences, the formal consequences imposed on my mother, and the support from authorities and allies created a sense of justice that extended beyond mere procedural outcomes. It was a profound acknowledgement of my courage, the legitimacy of my voice, and the importance of exposing hidden truths despite the risks involved. The new equilibrium was not perfect. Fear and uncertainty would occasionally resurface, but it represented a fundamental shift from oppression to empowerment, from isolation to support, from secrecy to truth. This stage of resolution marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which my experiences could be leveraged not only for personal recovery, but also as a source of strength and guidance for others facing similar challenges. The foundation of validation and protection had been established, and the trajectory of my life had irrevocably shifted towards safety, clarity, and empowerment. The protagonist, having navigated months of fear, manipulation, and mounting pressure, now stood on the threshold of transformation, equipped with the tools, support, and confidence necessary to embrace a life defined by truth, justice, and the reclamation of agency. The months following the formal resolution were a period of profound transformation, a time when the emotional, psychological, and physical scars from my experience began to intertwine with newfound strength and purpose. The home that had once been a battleground of fear, secrecy, and manipulation gradually became a space where I could reclaim autonomy, rebuild trust, and cultivate resilience. The interventions implemented by authorities, oversight of my mother's behavior, structured boundaries, and consistent support, ensured that safety was no longer a fragile or conditional state. Each day brought opportunities to engage in life without the shadow of intimidation, to assert my voice freely, and to explore the possibility of relationships grounded in respect rather than fear. While the memories of abuse and intimidation lingered, their power over me diminished as I recognized my ability to confront, survive, and thrive despite them. I began to reclaim routines that had previously been overshadowed by anxiety, fear, and the constant calculation required to navigate my mother's volatile moods. Morning rituals, meals, school preparation, and even small social interactions became arenas for asserting independence and rebuilding a sense of normalcy. My father, Ricardo, maintained a supportive but measured presence, stepping in when necessary, but allowing me to exercise agency in decisions that affected my life. For the first time, I felt fully empowered to make choices about my daily life without fearing disproportionate backlash. This sense of autonomy was transformative, reshaping the relationship I had with my parents and fundamentally altering the dynamics that had long defined our household. The shift was gradual but unmistakable. Each day of consistency reinforced the idea that courage and truth were not only morally right, but practically protective, enabling me to flourish despite past adversity. Emotionally, the transformation was even more profound. I experienced a growing sense of confidence, clarity, and resilience that had been inaccessible during the months of fear and secrecy. My voice, once suppressed by intimidation and the weight of secrecy, now carried authority and legitimacy. Speaking out was terrifying, but it had catalyzed a realization that truth carries intrinsic power, that personal integrity can withstand the pressures of manipulation, and that courage is a skill honed through action rather than mere intention. Each conversation, interaction, and decision I made reinforced my capacity to advocate for myself and navigate challenges without succumbing to fear. This newfound emotional strength allowed me to process trauma, establish healthier boundaries, and envision a future unshackled from the patterns of abuse that had long defined my life. School became a space of renewed possibility. Teachers, counselors, and administrators who had supported me throughout the investigation continued to provide encouragement, mentorship, and oversight, fostering an environment where learning and personal growth were central rather than overshadowed by fear. Friends who had witnessed subtle signs of distress or concern now interacted with me without hesitation, creating social spaces where trust, mutual respect, and shared experiences could thrive. The external validation I received through professional acknowledgement of the abuse, tangible protective measures, and support of social networks reinforced the internal transformation I was experiencing. Each successful interaction, each positive affirmation of my autonomy and courage built upon the foundation of resilience established during the months of confrontation and advocacy.
As I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point, I recognized that my experience had instilled a profound sense of purpose. The pain, fear, and isolation I endured had been transformative, equipping me with insight, empathy, and determination that could now extend beyond my personal life. I began to consider ways to support others facing similar challenges, advocating for children in abusive households, raising awareness about the importance of external validation and intervention, and sharing my story to empower those who might feel trapped in silence. My transformation was no longer solely about survival. It had evolved into a mission to create positive change, to leverage personal experience as a tool for advocacy, and to demonstrate the power of truth, courage, and perseverance. Physical reminders of the abuse, particularly my healed wrist, became symbols of resilience rather than vulnerability. The memory of the injury, once a source of fear and shame, now reminded me of my capacity to endure and overcome. Each scar, each moment of pain endured, was reframed as a testament to my strength and the choices I had made to reclaim my voice. My parents' responses, now constrained and monitored by external authority, served as further evidence that accountability is achievable and that the structures of justice and protection can validate and support survivors. The tangible and symbolic markers of my journey intertwined to create a powerful narrative of transformation, illustrating the triumph of courage, resilience, and truth over fear, manipulation, and secrecy. By the time I reached the point of full reflection, the transformation was complete. I had navigated fear, intimidation, and the lowest points of emotional and physical vulnerability, emerged with my voice intact, and claimed a position of empowerment within my own life. The experience had reshaped my relationships, reinforced my sense of self-worth, and provided a framework for ongoing personal growth. Beyond personal victory, I had cultivated the capacity to inspire and guide others, demonstrating that even in the most oppressive circumstances, courage and truth can prevail. The journey from fear to empowerment, from silence to advocacy, had reached its culmination, leaving me with a profound understanding of the strength inherent in speaking out, the necessity of accountability, and the enduring power of resilience in shaping a future defined not by past trauma, but by agency, hope, and purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.